Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak to everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today, I'm joined by guest Tim Sarrantonio to talk about different kinds of consultants and how they help nonprofits. Tim, welcome to the show.
Alex, thank you for having me to the show. I'm really excited to get into this very meaty topic.
Yeah, this actually came up from a LinkedIn post that you had made a few weeks ago. And I tried to contribute more to it. And I figured, there's so much meat here that I would love to deep dive, get more into it, and then toss some ideas back and forth. But before we get to all of that, maybe you can introduce yourself, tell people who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So again, I'm Tim Sarrantonio. I'm Director of Corporate Brand at Neon One. We're a technology and services company that focus on small shop nonprofits and the ways that technology can accelerate their generosity experiences in terms of design and execution. So that's just a fancy way of saying we help people be generous with tech. But there's a lot of different technology out there that does that, and education's a big, important part of that. So it's something I think about a lot because my role is to basically say who we are and why we matter to the larger nonprofit ecosystem. And a lot of that is in support of all the other great work that's happening at, places like Salesforce with, Dreamforce and the specific nonprofit conferences that they do, what's happening with National Council of Nonprofits and AFP and all the other acronyms out there as well.
Awesome. And before we get into the core of the subject, I'm curious to know how you got started working with nonprofits.
So my superhero origin story dates back to the recession in 2008. I, relating to education, thought I was going to be a labor historian. And so I got a PhD or was thinking I was going to get a PhD in labor history. I got a bunch of master's degrees. I lived in Ireland. I went to Columbia University in New York City. And all of that was in service to what I thought would be a healthy academic career, basically living in a cornfield in the Midwest. And so I moved to Chicago in preparation for what I thought was going to be my career path. Didn't work out. And my dad said, "You got to get a job, man." And so I obviously went to one of the most lucrative places possible, the nonprofit sector. All kidding aside, I got a job as a grant writer in 2008 for a very small grassroots organization. My starting salary is $29,000. And from there, I just kind of fell in love, though, with the community-driven aspect of it. And I kept leveling up into different larger organizations, finally working at a Catholic school in the north side of Chicago. Got 100 hours of Razor's Edge training and just fell in love with data. Fell in love with the transformative power of what databases and technology can represent to a mission, and had the opportunity open up to work directly for a provider in the nonprofit technology space that was at the time Z2 Systems, makers of Neon CRM. And from there, it's coming up to 11 years working for that company as it's evolved. So that's a little bit TLDR on that.
Lovely. And I love it. I might actually, if it's okay with you, steal it. The superhero origin story. That's beautiful wording. Do you mind if I grab that from you?
Go ahead. Yeah. If folks who are new to me will know that I'm very, very generous with this type of stuff. So please go ahead. No copyright there.
Thank you. Okay, so in your LinkedIn post, you had mentioned there are 4 primary groupings of consultants that help nonprofits.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking we could do is just go through each one of them, maybe give them a definition, define their roles a little bit, and then, see where things go from there.
Yeah, that sounds great. You've actually already contributed to my evolution on this topic, Alex. So
because I've added 2 more to that, but we'll get to those after the first 4. Okay, cool. So the first one is searchers. So what is a searcher?
So, yeah, and to even back up a tiny bit there is this is kind of my approach and categorization for my own work that's evolved. So when I first started at Neon, I was in direct sales and ended up working with over 800 nonprofits to onboard into our ecosystem. And through that time, I learned that consultants can have a very big impact in the sales process. And when I was kind of learning about the different types of consultants, because it was all new to me, right? Like you don't go to Columbia University's Teachers College and get taught about nonprofit technology consultants when you're getting a degree in history and education, right? So this was learning on the job. And in the beginning, I kind of butted heads because I kept thinking, why are you getting in the way of my sale? And then what I realized is you're not getting in the way of the sale. I'm not listening. And so I had to check myself, and I realized that once I got into it, there was different types of consultants, different types of focus areas. And so I came up with my own little proprietary, so to speak, way of grouping them. It's almost like, classification systems in role-playing games. I'm a big Final Fantasy nerd. And so I was like, okay, let me think about different like classifications that I can have, because they have their own kind of specializations. And so searchers are people who find the technology for the nonprofit. They might go out and they say, okay, I'm going to help you wade through something like an RFP. And so that's kind of the basics there, because what happens is that once they help choose the software, they tend to disappear, right? They're just helping search, finding your journey, guiding you through that choice, and then they're out. And so that's kind of the first grouping that I experienced during the sales process, at the very least.
Yeah, thank you for the backstory, because that's actually gives us a bit more context. And I also love the classes, because myself, actually, I'm an old Dungeons and Dragons player.
Yes,
and DM,
love
so
it.
I appreciate the classes element of it. Cool.
Love it.
These categorizations, before we actually, would you say they're more like actual roles, or are they more personas? Could they be achieved by the same person all the way through, or is it usually defined by, this is just a searcher, and to your point, they leave once the RFP is finished?
That's a hard question, Alex, only because I'm firmly in marketing now. And that's my role as director of corporate brand. And I'm actually embarking on a project right now to help rethink audience segmentation and design for when we're doing our marketing. I think that in the nonprofit sector, especially, vendors are really bad at this. I think that people tend to either market to every nonprofit, and hence they're not marketing to any nonprofit, or they're not thinking through their audience design. And so I've been delving into this, and this is actually why I even brought up the RPG element, so to speak, even internally to my team. I said, I want to rethink the idea of personas. If anything, they're more archetypes, right? And that's where these types of groupings make sense. But just like in something like Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games, folks, you can have different skill sets that cross over. There's actually a marketing approach called Poke mapping, and it's based off of the game Pokemon. And even within Pokemon, you can have different levels and evolutions of a different creature. I bet folks did not think we'd be talking about Pokemon in terms of consulting, but here we are. And I feel, Alex, that they can cross over in many ways, but some folks prefer to develop their specialization and kind of drill in and say, this is my expertise. And so if I am going out and finding technology for people, a lot of times what I found in practice is that the money that they're making is really going to kind of draw themselves toward one type of execution service. And hence they tend to kind of lean toward what's making them pay the bills. And a lot of times, if you're too cross-functional, that splits your attention and your ability to support clients. But again, that's not, this is where I lean on you, Alex, to kind of get your thoughts, because you're actually living it a heck of a lot more than me.
And I would use the word, just to really nerd down, the multi-class, where you have multi-specializations. But you're right, at a certain point, if you spread yourself out too thin, you become
master of none.
Yeah, jack of all trades, but master of none. Exactly.
Yes.
Well, I think there's some merit to specializing in each of these different archetypes to be able to better serve your nonprofit.
Yeah, multi-class is a really good thing here. I for the real nerds out there, Final Fantasy V, I believe, had the multi-class system. So, well, don't worry, folks. This is not going to turn into a whole role-playing thing. But I will tell you, Alex, I actually have developed a card game internally for audience design that leans into this.
That's probably a really good idea. Let's explore that one at some other point. Okay, going back to
Sure.
searchers then. So
Yeah.
searchers come in, they help with the RFP process, they help you to decide what software to buy. Is it just about software, or maybe they can recommend other partners as well? Like, where would if we were to define the role and the responsibilities of a searcher, where does it begin? Where do they come into, and where would they exit from?
I think we've seen different searchers in other skill sets, right? Like executive folks who are helping find and acquire employees for a nonprofit, right? Like recruiters. Recruiters is actually a good kind of other alternative view of the searcher class, so to speak, because they're going to come in and say, okay, I'm going to find you an executive and then I'm out. Right. Like you see this in the for-profit space all the time, where recruiters and recruitment firms are all over the place. So I feel like there's other ways that you can execute. It's just because my focus is technology, I tend to lean toward that, but I think it applies in other areas that a nonprofit's operations may touch on for sure. So we might end up focusing a lot, folks, in terms of technology today, but I think you can back this up and have this apply to anything that might operationally be a question a nonprofit has, board management. And we'll actually touch on that in terms of some of the classes that I've developed here. But especially with searchers, I think of the old school consultant, Robert Weiner. Robert Weiner is somebody who I did RFPs for all the time back in the early days of my career at Neon One. And he just kind of really helped me hone in the exemplary, kind of the perfect example of somebody who's a searcher is somebody like Robert Weiner, if anybody's ever worked with him.
Okay, so we got recruiters as a subset or a subclass. We're really nerding down now. We got software. So I imagine in the realm of software, it could be anything, right? It could be a CRM, it could be any kind of marketing tool, fundraising tool, donation, volunteer. Like there's no limit to where the searcher should be able to do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can even extend this out into kind of back-end computer infrastructure, right? Like which type of shop are we going to be? Are we going to, have Microsoft Teams executed versus Slack versus, what are we using for email? There's a lot of different questions that might get brought up, and many nonprofits might be making base assumptions or decisions where this isn't going to ultimately align with maybe this decision that they made on their CRM, right? Like I'm using XYZ email client, or I'm using Slack versus Teams. How does that even interact potentially with the CRM or my events tool, my project management tool? I mean, it's dizzying when you actually start to step back and look at all the decisions that somebody has to make here.
And I also imagine that cannot be the same person. Like someone who's a recruiter won't necessarily be able to offer advice on what kind of IT equipment you should have. So you might need to have more than one searcher.
I know. And that's where the costs start to come up. That's where somebody says, well, is this worth it doing this? And so I think a lot of times executionally, the searcher class tends to be focused on these really big procurement decisions that end up being made. And even within that, it might be depending on the size and revenue of the organization where they're going to make these types of investments. We have a community that we run in Slack called the Connected Fundraising Community, and it's got about 400 folks in it that just kind of discuss different things. And I've brought this question up: is when are you even relying on a consultant? And more often than not, I think a lot of the folks on their technology decisions are trying to DIY it sometimes, and that has pros and cons to it at this point.
Yeah, because I imagine that there's going to be a few of these roles, a few of these people rather, who will be able to offer insight on, let's say, technology. But if you're right, if there's a huge procurement process, it might make more sense to go outward, find the expert who's done this 1,000 times, more cookie cutter type of scenario for them, and have them help you and guide you.
Well, and it's an interesting note, like the weird push and pull relationship that a vendor has to have with this class in particular, because they will be aggressively agnostic if they're doing things in a way that's trying to say, hey, look, we're just trying to find the best solution, and we don't have necessarily an opinion on preferred software, right? So somebody like you, Alex, which specializes in the Salesforce ecosystem, that's kind of like where you're going to come in and say, look, I think this is a really good fit for you here versus, hey, you know what? Like, I specialize in Salesforce. I don't know if this is actually going to be the best fit for you. Go look somewhere else. Whereas somebody like Tech Impact, they're going to say, we know a little about a lot of different types of software, and they're going to be more kind of the breadth of knowledge versus the depth of knowledge where some particular ecosystems might have somebody who's like, I just love Blackbaud, or I just love Salesforce, or something like that. And you definitely see that more on the enterprise side, where, kind of the 3% of nonprofits that have revenues above 5 million in the US. And there's correlations internationally too with revenue bands, but especially those larger sized organizations, they might really, really, really benefit from this procurement process in particular.
It makes total sense. And just for the record, I acknowledge the fact that Salesforce isn't always the one-stop shop for all nonprofits. There are definitely scenarios where Salesforce is not the right tool. So I'm not usually I wouldn't be a good searcher basically because I am biased. but I do think that someone who is a better suited for this kind of overarching analysis to decide whether which CRM is the right choice, and then going from there.
And that's why there's different classes, right? And you've actually added to my depth here, so I'm excited to unpack those. But maybe we could talk about the next class, which is the trainer.
The trainer. So what is a trainer class?
Trainer class is an interesting one, and I think it's evolving more toward the ones that you've come up with, which are spoiler advisors and project overseers, right? And the traditional trainer is going to be somebody that says, hey, I'm going to tell you how to best use this software that you've chosen. And you most see this, especially in the Salesforce ecosystem, the Blackbaud ecosystem for third-party folks. So somebody like you, as an example, is a great option for somebody who says, look, I'm all in on Salesforce. And it's like, great. Like, you have Trailhead, but I might come in and tell you how to best use it for your needs. Now, this again gets into the evolution that we've seen, because I think I came up with this pretty early on, where it was more consultants who were coming in and saying, look, I know you have your own professional service team in-house, and this is where we probably see the most friction point is you have your own services, you might be charging for said services. Where do we fit here? And this is the one where I think the most nuance and discussion needs to be figured out. We've had this dance for a long time with great partners like Back Office Thinking that might come in and say, look, we want to help execute your CRM or your product offerings, but we want to be able to own some parts of the project. And this is where I think we're seeing less trainers as their specialization and more toward the ones that you've come up with that we can dive into later. But I think the ones that this type of class has gotten less prominent with the rise of self-serve things like Trailhead leading the way, like Blackbaud Institute, like what we've rolled out with Neon One Academy, where the basics of how to use software are now getting covered by a little bit more learning management system application that's more baked into the onboarding process. But they still exist. I think their role is evolving, though, as you flagged in your LinkedIn comments.
That would say, or are you suggesting that the trainer is such an overarching class that it would include or could include the advisor and the project overseers?
I kind of think so. Yeah, if I'm gonna,
it sounds like it.
Yeah, if I'm gonna I'm not necessarily beholden to just sticking to 4, Alex, right? Like I'm not going to say I only have 4, right? This is just kind of my own internal way of organizing things when I work with the partner ecosystem, because I have over 400 consultants that we've kind of certified and have onboarded into our larger partner network. And a lot of those are light. Like that's like I have a referral agreement. And even right now, I'm in process of overhauling that. So this is a very pertinent conversation. And you've given me a lot to think about in terms of what's the difference between somebody like an advisor versus a project management person. Ultimately, it still comes down to how does the nonprofit execute the technology stack that they've chosen? And so if anything, I think somebody like Tim Lockey, who has helped develop the human stack design, is really the one that I look to on what is this going to look like for the future. He's a great example of like the ideal state of what a trainer could be, an advisor, a project overseer.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to have Tim on the show a few weeks back. So when I saw trainers, I saw it as the classic trainers, meaning after things have been built, the trainer comes in and they teach you the train the trainer type of model where they teach you how to use the system, as opposed to here's how you implement it. So that's definitely a much, like I said, overarching role,
Yeah.
which could definitely include architects and advisors. To me, the advisor is someone who just guides without actually doing anything. And the project oversight is there's a larger team at play, and they are just making sure that the team is doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because a lot of times when you outsource to a vendor, for example, they might have their own architects, their own team in place, but you want somebody in your corner as well to make sure that there's a balance in the scale of things. And that's more seen on the larger enterprise level of nonprofits versus the smaller ones, which you just outsource everything to the vendor.
Yeah, you're right. And it might even be kind of the different nuances of what we're specializing in. You know, you look at somebody like Firefly Partners, who's going to come in and they might be handling elements of a website implementation, or we see this with peer-to-peer execution when they get involved, or somebody like Mark Becker gets involved from Cathexis Partners, where they say, okay, you're going to implement the Neon Fundraise product for peer-to-peer fundraising, and we need to enable these emails, and we need to set up this campaign design, and this is how this is going to integrate with the website. And they might lightly touch on the CRM side for syncing, but then especially with our Salesforce users for the Neon Fundraise product, you know, folks like Michael J. Fox Foundation, where they're like, they have Salesforce specialists in-house, but they might tap in, and I'm not saying Michael J. Fox necessarily does this, but some of the Salesforce organizations might say, look, we need an expert for the integration between these two. We know how the baseline works that the company's provided us, but we need to kind of think through the implications of table mapping for opportunities versus campaigns versus accounts, and you know, the like of that from an object standpoint. Somebody who's specializing in this is the best way to design an email nurture series in something like Pardot might be like, I don't know. When it comes to the Salesforce object side, right? So it gets very messy here in many different ways.
One could then extrapolate the trainer profile to the next one, which is coaches, because I see overlap in that. If trainers really are about execution, I mean, coaching is kind of along that same line as well, right? Coaching being the third class.
Yes, and so this is the one where I make a hard line around, for my personal definition, the involvement of the technology. And coaches have a subject matter expertise, at least my internal management of this, that they might not ever even touch the tech. And so coaches are subject matter experts in things that might auxiliarily touch the technology, or in some cases may never touch the technology. And the reason I had to develop this thought process, at least for my own internal management, was we do and celebrate a lot of fundraiser support on things like diversity, equity, inclusion. And so when I was creating our onboarding program for our consultant ecosystem, I wanted to have a larger tent that invited in people who do board management, who do diversity education, who might come in and even talk about some technology elements that have nothing to do with the immediate tech stack, like live streaming. Right? It's technology based. It might end up impacting the tools that we have, but we got nothing to do with how to set up, you know, OBS. Right? So there's specializations where it isn't necessarily technology focused that I wanted to take into account. So I would say that the only hard line I make is we don't need to be as involved in here. This is more values alignment driven, where it's like, I like you. I probably am never going to log into your single sign-on thing that you have, but I like you. And so I'm going to tell people that I like you. And bidirectionally, I would say, and I like you. So my client should look at your services for email copywriting or something like that.
I could also add then any kind of fundraising experts or campaign experts,
Correct.
any kind of experts in a field, like you said, that's non-technical. So would you not want to put then advisors, which is the category that I added, into the coaches more than the trainers?
It depends on the tech. I would say the foundational question is technology a driving decision that needs to be mutually decided upon between the different parties involved? Because we have to keep in mind that ultimately, no matter what, the client needs to be at the center of this conversation. And so they might not know what they don't know. And so an advisor might touch on technology, they might not. And so that's where it gets a little iffy in terms of how I would define that. And again, you've introduced the term to me, and I still need to kind of think through how I would do that elegantly.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because you're right. There could be, if you draw the line, if you want to draw the line between a tech person and versus a non-tech person, trainers being the technical side, and coaches being the non-technical side, the advisor could be on either side. I mean, depending on what kind of things that they're advising on, it could be tech or not tech related.
And that's where the multi-class comes into play, right? And I think that I like advisors in that case because they're a little bit more strategic, right? A lot of training, a lot of coaching, and especially coaches might bristle at this, so don't come at me, but it might be more tactical in nature. And advisors might straddle the role of technology from a tactical execution standpoint but to say strategically toward your growth goals, toward your KPIs, this is what I think you should do, and this is how the technology should be thought of. That's possibly the role of the advisor, where they're straddling the strategy and the tactics of execution.
Was a follow-up conversation or thread that you started talking a bit about how you believe there's a shift, that training is shifting to advisory guidance in the coming years.
Yes.
Can you add a bit more color to that? Because that obviously is related to exactly what we're talking about right now.
I think it's because learning management, if I remember thinking back to 10 years ago, I had to even convince people that the cloud was safe. And when I got my Razor's Edge training, the vast majority of the most effective training was done in person. I went to a classroom in downtown Chicago and sat in a computer, and I had an instructor there, and they said, here is your Razor's Edge system. You can screw it up. You can make Robert Hernandez be marked as dead, and it's not going to impact anything in your own database. And what has happened is that we can't think of all of these things happening in a vacuum. And so there's a larger technology world impacting ours. So things like learning management systems, things like the security of cloud systems, where we're not relying on rack space, charging an arm and a leg for server management, but now you have something like Azure and AWS infinitely making those costs lower. And so technology companies of all different types and stripes have been able to sprout up. And one of the most interesting ones is the learning management system ecosystem of software. And so being able to take off the shelf a really solid platform to train people means that the costs of execution on the vendor side and the nonprofit side go down. And hence a third-party person coming in and saying, I'm going to tell you how to use this software because you're not getting an answer from your vendor is going away. A really good example of this is what Corner Shop had to do for Salsa for the longest time, where when especially that company was acquired by one of the many private equity hopscotches that have happened over the years with them, their support started to suck. I'm just going to say it. And third parties needed to step in order to actually support that CRM. And now that it's going away and you have things in the Bonterra ecosystem focused on every action network for good, there's a more set infrastructure for training. And a lot of that's driven because they have things like LMS systems. So the trainer, the third-party trainer, needs to kind of evolve their role now that a lot of the costs there have dropped on both the vendor side and the client side.
I find LMSs and, for example, Trailhead in particular, very good to give you a foundation, and especially if
Yes.
you're starting from absolute zero, it's tough sometimes for a trainer to start at that level. But I think, to your point, a good trainer, a good advisor would be able to elevate you from the generic learning material that's available on Trailhead to something that's more specific to your use case, or be able to, of course, answer questions in return. Because with any LMS, it's only a one direction consuming type of, what's the right
There's
word?
there's still executional assumptions that are being made
Right.
by the person who's putting together the curriculum. I mean, we've hired dedicated PhDs in education for Neon One Academy to re-envision it, but we still have people who do project management internally for things like data imports and basic configuration. We still need to have conversations on user cohort learning and in-person experiences, and what we're doing at our conferences like Generosity Exchange, where we hold them for free for the sector, but there's a lot of Neon One tech talked about there. One concrete example that I point to in my own life is I do volunteer work for local organizations here in upstate New York. And so when I would go in and we would start talking about usage of Neon CRM, I would say, I don't want to talk about how to enter a gift. There's a guide, there's a training on that. And I've seen so many nonprofits create policies and procedures manuals that are basically just copying what we've already written down in, here's how to create a campaign, here's how to create a account custom field or a custom object table. And I want to say, don't do that, because one, it's going to get out of date. It takes one thing in our Zendesk, guides channel in Slack to be like, update this. And our team comes in and updates it. And if somebody's written down and copy and pasted things from the guide, it's out of date, because nobody's sitting there, tapping their fingers together going, I can't wait till Neon One updates this guide on email, configuration, right? Nobody's doing that. So don't do that. If somebody on the vendor side has created something that is the basics, lean on them for that. And then you think strategically, how do I execute that relating to my mission? And that's where advisors come in. That's where trainers come in my opinion.
The fourth then class is managers.
Yes. And this is a little bit niche. So Neon CRM, what I also learned is that we, compared to other parts of the ecosystem, we balance a healthy mix of 501c3s, 4s, and 6s. And it's the 6s that tend to have managers. And managers are people who come in and they say, I'm going to manage the database on behalf of the nonprofit client. And this could be wildly confusing if not thought out. And there's a lot of structural things that vendors need to put in place to do this properly. Now, I'm going to point to another ecosystem and another use case as the gold standard here, which is Intuit, and how they handle their pro advisor CPA access, where they say, okay, we're going to make it really easy for a CPA to come in and manage a QuickBooks account on behalf of multiple clients that they may have. And so managers, you don't see this a lot on the fundraising side as much as compared to the association 501c6 side, where there's professional associations like doctors that may have somebody come in. There's actually like one dude that made me think of this, that's been working with us for years, a guy named Keith Magnan, who just kept bringing us all these associations, and he would say, I'm the one managing this. But the recurring revenue was so significant that it's like, oh, we need like a separate process for this situation. And so we've developed things like multi-client, because we try to have a single sign-on based around an email for security purposes, and it has multi-factor authentication and all that good stuff. But like, you can log in now and manage multiple CRM instances. And in turn, we have a new website product called Neon Websites, where we extended it out, where somebody like a marketing agency might come in and want to manage multiple websites from Neon Websites on behalf of their clients. And so we need to like take that into account for support, for training, for execution, for even like logging in. And not every ecosystem has taken that into account, but Intuit, Salesforce, these are kind of the gold standard on when you have a manager come in and say, look, I still need to kind of like work with multiple clients. So it's more niche, but it's important to make a distinction there.
I'm hearing that managers are more the techies that run the show versus the managers that actually organize the people around
That's
the
right.
technology. Okay.
Yeah. This is like send the email for me, pull the report.
Okay, so they're the ones who are there for the long term. Then they're actually the ones keeping things afloat and operating well.
Yeah, and I learned this because I think I have a unique insight. Because before I moved to upstate New York, I lived in Chicago for 10 years, fell in love, met my wife there, had my first child out of 3 there. And in Chicago, there's just a large amount of management firms for associations. And it's almost, and we see this like Giving Institute. Giving Institute actually has a really tight relationship with a management firm. And so I like talk to the management firm if I need to pay dues, if I need to get like contact information updated, if it's not self-service in a portal. And so a lot of times you're not actually interacting with the client of theirs unless it's coming to like educational content or things like that. If it's more like money related, I might be talking to a management firm instead. And Chicago just has like entire companies devoted to this in the downtown area. So it's, again, a very interesting one that doesn't come up a lot, especially for small shops. We have a handful of people who do outsource that on the small side because they're just overwhelmed. And they say, look, I can't handle this. I don't want to manage the CRM. I'm going to focus on my mission. And so this gets a little weird on the fundraising side too, because it's like, well, who's accountable? So a lot to unpack there for sure.
I see this very commonly on the enterprise size level of nonprofits where you have a managed support. This way you have maybe a tier 1 locally, internally, just to be able to handle, the first level of incidents and concerns and questions. But then there's this managed support team, which is an external vendor that you assign those tier 2, tier 3 type of support to actually solve the issue, to troubleshoot it, to fix it, and then to add it to your environment. So that makes sense.
And we actually, heck, now that you're saying that, it made me think we had to do that for Generosity Exchange, our virtual conference. I had different levels of support where our team was handling initial tickets. Like, I can't log in. It's like, okay, like, can you try this? And then if we run into a tech issue, it's like, I don't have any access to Hopin's like back end, but we need accelerated services during an intense period of usage, like a conference. And so having that they actually hooked us up with a support firm out of Canada, MKEM, and they were great. But like, I wouldn't put them in front of our clients automatically because they're not going to know like our brand, our story. They're there to just make sure that the platform works. So it might not be for the long haul, but you do see this in some instances for especially on enterprise usage. Peer-to-peer fundraising is another good example where it might be kind of a temporary situation.
Right. And then, so those are the 4 plus 2 subcategories.
Yes.
I'm curious then, how reliant do you think a nonprofit organization should be on these types of consultants? Like, is it necessary to use all 4 or part of them? Like, what would be some guidelines to know, first of all, maybe we need a certain type of class, a certain type of consultant, or what would be other considerations to know that we need to use a consultant versus doing something in-house?
Budget. You start with budget, and you don't start with P&L. You start with revenue projections versus expenses. And a lot of nonprofits, especially on the small side, they make their decisions based off of P&L, and that's dangerous. And so look at your budget and look at your headcount needed to fill the budget. How many FTEs, full-time equivalencies, do I need at 40 hours to execute my mission? This is where large discussions on overhead, which could be its own podcast episode and outside, definitely the realm of today. But like, you have to look at the budget to say, how am I going to actually execute on the things that I want to do in the coming year? And then what I have heard in our community is people at all sizes will look at that if they're doing it properly and say, we think that we need this, we could do this in-house, but we're going to put some money off to the side, either as a retainer for a specific type of consultant that we need, a searcher, a trainer, a coach, a manager, an advisor, project overseer, any of the classes, or a kind of a rainy day fund. Because you might need these things in temporary instances, like you might need somebody to come in and manage a portion of your operations because somebody left. The average tenure for fundraisers in our sector is 18 months now, right? And so if your database administrator, your development associate leaves and you need somebody to do it and the ED's not going to come in there and actually run the reports or pull the emails or set all this type of stuff up, who's going to help? And we actually have a great client, Team Gleason Foundation, where Kelly Claver is a consultant that works with them and executes things, and they consider her a part of their staff in many ways, but she's a third-party consultant. And they've developed great processes and procedures, and we actually spotlighted them in our Dream Big conference back in the summer, and they talked about this. And people were in the comments saying, yeah, but you have to be huge, right? Like, you're bringing in, $50,000 in this one campaign. You have to have a very large organization that, like, a bunch of staff that's handling this. And they're like, no, we have 2.5 people, and the half person is Kelly, because she's not fully working for us. She has other clients. So it comes down to money, and it comes down to allocation of your headcount.
And then I would also see it, a consultant could be coming in just for something very surgical, right? They come in, they do some tactical advice, they get you back on the rails, and then they can step away. So it's not something, I mean, you gave one scenario where the consultant is more of a long-term situation, and that obviously happens in different scenarios. But sometimes an advisor, for example, comes in 2-3 months, gets you back on track, and then you're off, you're on your own until the time comes where you fall off the wagon again.
Have you ever seen the clip of Steve Jobs talking about consultants?
No.
It's a good one, and I'll pop it on over to you after, but I posted it internally to one of our project teams because he's in front of a class. It might be at MIT or something like that, and he's talking about how he doesn't like consultants because they don't have a long-term commitment to the mission of the organization, the mission of what's getting executed. And it's Steve Jobs, so there's obviously an element that you have to pay attention there. But I think he doesn't give enough credit when watching that on some of the specialist needs that might crop up, especially in the nonprofit space. He was a very we're going to do it all person. It's like, well, a lot of nonprofits don't have that money or time.
And there's something to be said about keeping your knowledge in-house versus, like you said, externally. But there's a place for everything, right? Depending on what your need is. Having the right person at the right time for the right amount of time for the right price, can be astronomically impactful.
You know what? I'm kind of coming to an evolution in terms of my career in marketing. And there's this great thought leader, Chris Walker from Refine Labs. And I was listening to a podcast that he was putting out, and he was talking about how in the tech side, for product development, teams have that kind of Kanban process for project design. They go from ideation to execution, right? And that might be 5 stages. And he's like, but you don't see this in marketing. And he focuses on marketing, but he's talking about revenue, R&D, research and development. And it's a fascinating concept that I'm going to start unpacking internally. But I think it's interesting to think about if you look at your operations on something that's forward-facing for revenue. For nonprofits, it would be fundraising. For businesses like ours, it's going to be, acquiring clients and things of that nature. But you have to kind of make decisions on allocation, on headcount and resources. And he's proposing for new channels, at the very least, a R&D process where it's like, okay, I have an idea and it needs to hit this stage before I start making further investments. And I think that's a really interesting concept to apply here on when you have to tap in a third party, right? Like video. right? I'm gonna kind of tap in a specialist in video. Depending on the type of video that's getting executed, we might want to bring that in house eventually, right? So there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say something similar where sometimes it's hard to find that internal person or train that internal person. It's faster, quicker, better to get the expert who's done it, 1,000 times before, come in, do what needs to be done, and then leave. But you're right. There's at the same time, on the flip side of things, they don't have that long-term investment in the success of the company or the organization.
Yes.
So it's a balance of knowing what to do when. And I've heard somewhere that there's a metric, I forget offhand where it was, that there are more consultants these days than there were in the past. The trend seems to be heading in the direction of more external consultants in the general field of things. Have you noticed that as well?
Isn't the flip thing if you can't if you can't do teach, right? Which is insulting to teachers. And as somebody who's going to go into education, there you are. But there has been definitely a rise in the number of consultants out there in the nonprofit space, and there's a balkanization of learning that we're starting to see, where I see a lot of individual consultants and specialists on the coach side, going back to the non-tech side, where they're going to say, I'm going to give you a course, and that course is going to teach you how to do donor site visits, right? It's like, do I really need to pay several $100s or $1,000 or whatever for this tactical thing? Like, where does this fit in my strategy? And I think a lot of nonprofits should step back and go, is this going to accelerate my goals, my KPIs? And then that's where you could start making investments in terms of that.
Awesome. We covered a lot of material today. I'm sure there's a lot more we could have covered, but I
know we didn't even get into RFPs or
exactly.
The role of vendors and stuff like that. I know I have a hard stop, so I have to cut it a bit, but this was great.
Tim, I really appreciate your time today. Where can people find more about you online?
LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. I have a newsletter that I put out weekly on kind of the role of technology and donor insights and fundraiser support. I think anybody can get benefit from it, but I specifically focus on small shop nonprofits. But yeah, LinkedIn's a good one. If people want to drop me a line, tim@neon1.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Tim.
Hey, thank you, Alex, for having me. This was an absolute blast.
All right, folks, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again next time for Agents of Nonprofit.